Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are on part 2 now of our series on cultivating chastity, and we are going to talk about some of the errors that the Church has made in our own response to the sexual revolution. As we mentioned in the introduction, we failed pretty badly, empirically speaking. This time, we are going to talk about some of the specific problems with some of our main messages. And I'm going to start with an example from my own backyard here. This is a book that was put out by Concordia Publishing House, which is the official publishing house of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is my denomination. This came out in 1967. It's called Parents' Guide to Christian Conversation About Sex. And I found it in my church library. And a lot of the book takes the form of a Q&A. You know, if your teenager asks you, some question, like, here's what you're supposed to say as a good Christian parent. So here's the response. Here's what you're supposed to say. If your teenager asks you, what's wrong with sexual relations before marriage? I'm sure you understand that God made intercourse for marriage. It is such an intimate act that it cannot really fulfill its unique function according to God's plan outside of marriage. Certainly not in a parked car. The sex act is supposed to be the climax of a love relationship between two people who have married and lived together and share life together. It is an expression of the deep, lasting, personal relationship that exists between husband and wife. It expresses the total unity that they share as husband and wife. Before marriage, there is no such unity to express, and physical intimacies become merely a satisfaction of physical desires. True love is always more than that. Be sure not to think of love and sex as synonymous. So, what's the main message there? Why is sex outside of marriage wrong? Well, it's because sex is supposed to be the climax of a love relationship. Only married people have enough romantic intimacy for sex to be more than just a matter of physical desires, to be true love. And there's some big problems with this one. This is not actually biblical teaching. You're not going to find that anywhere in the Bible, which is not a great start if you're trying to explain God's purpose in reserving sex for marriage. And B, it's not even true, really. And again, since this is a Lutheran publication, if you want a good counterexample to what they're saying here, consider Martin and Katie Luther. They did not get married because of romance. Luther was obviously a highly prominent public figure, and he did write about his own marriage periodically. And if you have ever read his explanation for why he got married, which he wrote at the time, he has just about the least romantic reasons possible for getting married. He wanted to set a good example because he had been advising monks and priests who could not live up to their vows of celibacy to get married instead. So he wanted to provide a good example there. He wanted to please his father. Because, let's face it, every parent wants their kids to have kids of their own someday. They want grandbabies. He wanted to spite the Pope. that was on his list as well. Not really romantic reasons. And so if you don't know the story, Catherine von Bora, she was a nun, and she and a number of other nuns in the convent wanted to escape, and Luther helped them escape their convent and brought them to Wittenberg. And ultimately, they got married after a matter of weeks, knowing each other just for a matter of weeks. And not because they were so very much in love with one another, but because they both thought it was a good idea for them to get married. So they got married because they thought it was a good idea. And then they had sex. And this is back in the days of witnesses, so we know that's the case. And then, after that, further down the road, the love relationship slowly developed because of the marriage relationship. You didn't have the marriage relationship growing out of the love relationship. It was exactly the other way around. Which is not unusual throughout history. Romance, then marriage, which is the way we look at it today, and we're aghast if anybody ever suggests otherwise. That's really the outlier, historically speaking. But even though it was completely backwards, according to our own cultural standards, it was an extremely successful marriage by almost any measurement. They had a bunch of kids whom they loved. They had a very happy home, a very active home. They left an enduring legacy for the church. And as you can tell from Luther's later writings, they did come to genuinely love one another in the romantic sense as well. There was a great deal of love in that marriage, even if that wasn't the foundation of the marriage in the first place. And they accomplished all those things. They had this wonderful, successful marriage without building on romance as the solely appropriate foundation for it all. And that's really the key problem with the message in this and all sorts of places in our culture, that they use romance as the foundation of sexual morality, that sex is only legitimate if it is sufficiently romantic. A parked car simply will not do, because sex is supposed to be the climax of a love relationship. Well, no. Marriage goes on for a long, long time after the wedding night. Okay, it's not the climax of the love relationship. It is the budding of the love relationship. Nobody wants it to be all downhill after the wedding night, and it's not. This entire explanation that they give here is basically a rhapsody about how only married people are emotionally intimate enough to have sex, to have legitimate sex. And that is a rationale that falls completely flat. If it's all a matter of emotional intimacy, of having the right feelings, then all that really means to any teenager or any young person really, which, who is the intended audience for this book, all it really means to any of them is that sex is okay if you feel like having sex, if it's all based on feelings. Which is exactly how people were already seeing it back in the 60s when this thing was written. So it's like, oh yeah, we're going steady. So we are united in a deep and lasting romantic relationship, and we do want to express that unity with one another. Always remember, feelings are subjective. You cannot meaningfully tell another person, well, you think you feel the right feelings, but you don't really feel the right feelings. What you feel for that person isn't the real version of those feelings. You can't tell that. If it's all a matter of feeling sufficiently intimate, who are you to say whether their feelings of intimacy are sufficient or not? You have no idea. Feelings are subjective, and you have no business telling them whether or not their feelings are the right kind of feelings. But no, far from teaching biblical morality, basing your case against fornication on it being necessary to have the right kind of feelings, that doesn't oppose what the culture is teaching, what the sexual revolution is teaching. Instead, it accepts and reinforces the false cultural belief that it is pleasure, in the form of romantic intimacy in this case, that it's pleasure rather than marriage that legitimizes sex. And that is everywhere in our culture. TV teaches that romance legitimizes sex. Movies teach that romance legitimizes sex. Think back over some of the stuff that you have watched over the course of your life and consider how often you were cheering on adultery and you were cheering on fornication by your favorite characters simply because it was really, really romantic when it happened. And, so that's the whole will they, won't they drama, right? Which almost always ends with oh yeah, they will. And it always ends up happening when they're finally overcome by a storm of the emotions that they've been holding in this whole time, and they finally give in to it, and then it's okay because it's romantic. But the Bible teaches that it is marriage, not romance, which legitimizes sex. That is a completely different basis for sexual morality. And by the way, that is just as important to remember after marriage, during marriage rather, than it is before marriage, as it is before marriage. Because we do the same thing within marriage. We teach that, it's if the feelings have become insufficient, then the marriage is no longer valid. And it can be dissolved. It really should be dissolved if you're not really truly in love with one another anymore, which is not the biblical teaching. That is not the Christian message there. Anybody who has divorced their spouse simply because they felt unhappy or they were no longer in love, they committed a grievous sin against their family of which they ought to repent. So none of this is to say that romance is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. I love romance. It's great. It's a lot of fun, and it is one of the great gifts that God attaches to sexuality. My point is simply that romance does not provide any kind of moral license for sex. And when we echo the culture's message that that's really the basis for sexual morality, we really undermine biblical morality rather than teaching it. Another error that the church has made in response to the sexual revolution is basing its case on delayed gratification. This one isn't as common as the romance one, but it happens quite a bit. Basically the message that, well, sex is better if you wait until marriage. That's why you should wait. It's because sex is just better if you do. And there's a kind of a crass example of this in there was a documentary, Friends of God, a road trip with Alexandra Pelosi and I think daughter of Nancy Pelosi. I don't remember the exact relationship there, but there was one. And anyway, there's a scene with Ted Haggard. And yes, it is that Ted Haggard. It was before I don't remember the details of the scandal, but there's some kind of sex drug scandal that he was involved in while he was a mega church pastor. And anyway, he mentions this survey that evangelicals have better sex lives than other groups. And then he asked some of the young men with him, it's like, hey, tell the camera how often you sleep with your wives and how often they climax. And what percentage of the time? And of course, the young men with them, they get really, really favorable responses to this, of course, right? So that's basically the case here. It's delayed gratification. You'll have a better sex life if you wait until marriage. And at least this one is true statistically speaking, at least. People who have waited and people who are married and have waited tend to report more frequent sex and more satisfaction with their sex lives than unmarried people and people who did not wait until marriage. But even if it happens to be accurate, it still completely misses the point. It misses the primary challenge that our culture is presenting us with. Because if you're basing the case for abstinence around delayed gratification, again, you're accepting and reinforcing the erroneous idea that sexuality is really all about being gratified. And we're just giving you a better technique for being gratified than the culture gives you. And that misses the point completely. It misses the moral question entirely. Because when you take this approach, sexual morality merely becomes a preference, which it has to do with your own personal gratification, which is not really morality anymore. There's not a law that you're violating. It's just it's in your best interest. And it becomes as trivial as, well, do you prefer to receive your lottery winnings in one lump sum or in monthly installments over, the next 20 years? Because you'll get more money if you take it over the next 20 years. So, completely overlooks the purpose of sex, completely overlooks the basis of sexual morality, and points everything right back to our own personal gratification, which is where our culture wants us to be staring anytime we approach this issue. Last big error of the church in this is basing their argument, founding it on the idea that, well, premarital sex is dangerous, and this was the primary way that abstinence programs tended to take this approach, right? Again, so you're making an appeal to self-interest, that there are all sorts of risks associated with premarital sex. There are all these diseases you can contract, and there's all the stress of unexpected pregnancies and the consequent fatherlessness that is usually involved there. High risks of suicide, high risk of divorce, high risks of emotional distress and mental illness, and so on and so on. And again, this one at least is true. Those are real risks. Okay, those are real risks. I don't want to trivialize those because a lot of them are actually very serious. And the fact that such consequences are natural results of violating the moral law, that does give us some clues about the nature of said law and it serves as a reminder of the law. So it's at least this one is true, and it's not like you should never mention this because at the very least these are important things to know. But if that's the whole of your message, or if that's even the core of your message, it still completely misses the point. Most adults are are going to recognize a very serious flaw in solely taking this approach, and that is a full life, even a full Christian life, is a life that involves taking calculated risks. You cannot live a good life by hiding from anything that might possibly have negative consequences for you. And what's more, many of the risks, a lot of them can be mitigated, at least to some degree, by various techniques and equipments that everybody teaches about in school. And I mean, the effectiveness of those is often oversold. I mean, people think they can just turn off their fertility, but the number of abortions that we have every year just proves how much of a lie that is. And certainly, you don't have protection for the emotional and psychological damages that come out of a lot of this. But nevertheless, even though there's quite a bit of truth to it, at the same time, your message is not be chaste. Your message is be careful. And that is a different message than the biblical one. A reasonable person could very well conclude that, well, it is worth the risk as long as he takes this, sufficient precautions. And many people do exactly that. So a lot of people are not convinced by that line of reasoning at all. But in a way, it's almost worse when they are convinced by this line of reasoning, because at that point, what you've begun to do is make a virtue out of being timid when it comes to sexuality. Where those who abstain solely for these reasons, they're no longer practicing the virtue of chastity, which is the correctly directing our sexuality, but they're actually just frozen with fear. They're afraid of doing anything with their sexuality. When we treat timidity as this virtue, we foster the idea that nice guys and good girls, of course, are sedentary when it comes to sex. And they never learn to pursue the appropriate use of their sexuality. And in many cases, when it comes right down to it, abstinence is abandoned anyway if a relatively safe prospect happens to fall in somebody's lap. Like the romance issue, this was another one of the really big pitfalls of purity culture. He talked to all these people in purity culture, and a lot of them, they were just sitting around waiting for Mrs. Right or Mr. Right to show up, and the whole time just being too scared to actually make finding someone and marrying them and forming a relationship with them a priority in their lives. And they sit around wondering, well, why hasn't marriage ever happened to me? Without understanding that marriage isn't something that happens. It's something that you make happen. It's something that you pursue. So when we were teaching the younger generations all of this nonsense, all these big errors, we were never teaching them biblical sexual morality. What we were doing was teaching them indefinite celibacy, which is not the same thing. That's the vow that monks and nuns take, that they abstain from sex completely. And that's ultimately what we were teaching them. Abstain from sex completely until marriage, but never actually talking about how to get from point A to point B. And that's a big difference from what the Bible teaches. And that's a difference that we are going to talk about next time. So please click that thumbs up button, comment, subscribe, share, etc. And join us next time when we consider why exactly the church was teaching celibacy and why we need to stop.